We're going to be exploring psephology, which is
The science of voting.
science of voting, yeah, to try to understand what really makes people tick at the polls. We're going to be starting with the Columbia model.
Okay.
This model says that we can predict someone's vote based on which social groups they belong to, like their age, their race, their religion, that sort of thing.
But the reality is that research shows that it only increases our ability to predict someone's vote by about 12%. It's better than nothing.
So basic demographics alone aren't enough to crack the code of voting behavior. What about party affiliation? Does that hold more weight?
So this is where the Michigan model comes in. This is based on a really influential study from the 1960s called the American Voter. And this model argues that identifying with a political party
Right.
is a powerful, often lifelong thing, almost like a religious affiliation.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. This model suggests that people actually shift their views on issues
Yeah.
to align with their party. It's not that they're choosing a party based on their beliefs,
Yeah.
but rather their beliefs are being shaped by the party they belong to.
And this model suggests that we're actually quite calculating when it comes to voting, so that voters are carefully assessing which party best serves their own personal interests.
It seems like people's votes are driven by more than just economic factors these days.
You're right. For decades, pocketbook issues were the main focus of elections. But now we see cultural issues like immigration and societal values increasingly taking center stage.
Something bigger than just economic interest is influencing their votes.
Yeah.
So this brings us to sorting.
Which we're seeing particularly in the U.S., this sharp division where liberals are aligning with the Democrats and conservatives are aligning with the Republicans.
Yeah.
And this intensifies political polarization for sure, but it also raises the question like, how much are our pre-existing identities dictating our choices? It's even gotten to the point where
That's what kind of coffee you drink.
the coffee you drink or the car you drive
Yeah.
almost become signals of your political tribe.
It's like we're sorting ourselves into these really neatly defined boxes.
And this is all happening against a backdrop of declining voter turnout, especially among younger people.
Are they disillusioned with the established parties? Or is there a deeper issue here, like a weakening of social bonds and trust in institutions? So we're dealing with this perfect storm of social groups, party loyalty, self-interest,
Right.
and now this powerful sorting effect.
Right.
How do we even begin to make sense of all these competing forces?
There's this really helpful concept called the funnel of causality.
Okay.
Imagine a funnel.
Okay.
At the top, you have these broad factors like demographics.
Okay.
As you move down the funnel, it narrows to more immediate things,
Okay.
like how you feel about the candidates right before you go to vote.
Okay, but how much weight does each factor really carry? Because I'm still stuck on the fact that demographics alone seem to have such weak predictive power.
Let's look at some specific research.
Okay.
So studies using data from the American National Elections Study, or ANES,
Okay.
show that even when you consider a whole range of demographic factors like age, education, race, marital status, you could only explain about 12% of the variation in whether people vote Republican or Democrat.
That's barely a nudge past just randomly guessing.
Pretty much.
Demographics are basically useless in predicting someone's vote.
Yeah, pretty much. Even within that small 12, race emerges as the strongest demographic predictor.
Okay.
But even its impact is limited. So it's much more revealing when we start looking at people's opinions on specific issues.
So knowing someone's stance on things like government spending or healthcare tells us more about how they'll vote than knowing their age or income.
Absolutely. When you add those issue positions to the model, its predictive power jumps to over 50%.
Wow, that's a big jump.
But the real game changer is when we factor in party identification and ideology.
Okay, so now we're moving down that funnel,
Right.
getting closer to the heart of the voting decision.
Exactly.
What happens to the predictive power when you add those elements?
The accuracy shoots up to a whopping 73%.
Wow. Knowing someone's party affiliation and where they stand on the liberal-conservative spectrum
Right.
are incredibly strong indicators of their voting behavior.
Yeah, in fact, party identification emerges as the single most powerful factor in the entire model.
Even more so than specific issue position. So our sense of belonging to a political tribe trumps a lot of other considerations.
It seems that way.
But hold on, we're still missing one crucial piece of the puzzle, aren't we? How do people evaluate the specific candidates running for office? So when we factor that in,
When we factor that in, the model's predictive power climbs even higher.
it reaches
77%.
77%.
So in the end, does it boil down to our gut feeling about the people on the ballot?
It seems that way our party loyalty might nudge us in a certain direction,
Right.
and our views on issues add some weight, but ultimately it's our judgment of the candidates that seals the deal. But even with all those factors accounted for, we're still only at 77% predictive power. That means there's still a sizable chunk of the vote. What could be driving those choices?
That's where things get really intriguing. That remaining 23% points to the role of individual experiences, personal circumstances,
Okay.
maybe even those last-minute gut feelings that defy easy categorization. There's always an element of unpredictability, of human choice, that keeps things interesting.
And maybe a bit frustrating for the psephologist trying to make sense of it all.
Probably.
We were just talking about the shift from economic issues to cultural issues
Right.
dominating the political landscape.
In the past, voters were primarily concerned with, you know, what we might call bread and butter issues, like jobs, taxes, the economy. But as societies become more affluent and secure, research suggests that people's values start to shift.
So once our basic needs are met, we start thinking about things.
Exactly. And political scientists, Ronald Eaglehart and Pippa Norris,
Hmm.
call these post-material values. So things like self-expression, quality of life, and social issues. These concerns become more prominent as basic material needs are increasingly met. It has a huge impact on how parties campaign and how voters make decisions. We see it reflected in party platforms, where cultural issues are increasingly front and center. And this shift also helps explain why issues like immigration have become such potent political flashpoints in recent years.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned immigration. A really powerful example of this in the data you shared earlier.
Right.
For many white American voters in the 2016 election, attitudes towards immigration were a stronger predictor of support for Donald Trump than their income level. That's like cultural anxieties can actually outweigh economic concerns in some cases. And you mentioned earlier that consumer preferences are becoming politicized.
Yes.
It seems like this shift toward cultural issues is further dividing us into these distinct political camps. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it definitely creates a feedback loop. As parties emphasize cultural issues, voters become more attuned to them, which in turn reinforces party messaging and deepens the divide.
Yeah.
It's a recipe for polarization, for sure.
And this is all happening at a time when social trust is declining. We touched on how younger generations are less likely to vote. Could this be connected to a broader sense of disillusionment with institutions and with each other?
Political scientist Robert Putnam
Okay.
wrote a really influential book called Bowling Alone, where he explored this decline in what he called social capital. And he argues that this erosion of social capital has weakened our sense of community and civic engagement.
So it's not just about politics then, it's about this fraying of the social fabric. When we don't trust each other or our institutions, it becomes harder to find common ground, to compromise, to work together to solve problems. I can see how that feeds into the cynicism and apathy we see in so many voters.
Right.
Like, why bother participating if you feel like the system is rigged,
Right.
if you don't believe your voice actually matters?
And that's precisely where the danger lies. When people disengage from the political process, it creates a vacuum that can be filled by those who exploit division and grievance. And we see this happening with the rise of populist movements that often prey on people's fears and anxieties.
So we end up in this vicious cycle where declining trust leads to disengagement, which then fuels polarization and empowers those who benefit from a divided society. It's a pretty sobering thought.
It is sobering, but I think it's also a call to action.
Okay.
To foster a sense of shared purpose, to create spaces for dialogue and understanding across political divides. It's a daunting challenge, but it's essential if we want to create a more just and equitable future.
We've unpacked these complex factors that influence voting behavior, deep-seated identities, fleeting candidate evaluations, and now these powerful social trends like realignment and polarization. Where do we go from here?
By understanding the forces at play, the psychological biases, the social influences, the systemic factor, we can become more conscious, more critical consumers of political information. Listen to perspectives different from our own and try to find common ground where possible.
That sounds like a tall order in our current climate of intense partisanship.
It is. We're social creatures wired for connection and belonging, and those instincts can powerfully influence our behavior even in the voting booth.